Today we're going to look at mainly this chapter 18 of my book, which is the role of kata in training. When you want to train in a realistic way in the martial arts, it's very easy to dismiss kata as being impractical. So you've got the guys in the gym, they're punching bags and they're punching mitts and they're sparring. And for some people, it's very difficult to translate the value of kata. On the other hand, I have friends who have had plenty of very, very realistic street fight situations, often against multiple attack. And if you ask them, they will tell you that 90% of their street fights were movements taken straight out of kata. I just think it's more or less the way the individual approaches the training of the kata. Of course, you can train kata and get really, really good at kata and have absolutely no practical impact in your fighting skills. There's no doubt about that, and we acknowledge that. We want to go through today specifically some of the points that I've made in chapter 18 of the Budo karate of Master Oyama. Oh, and the good news is the Polish version is now available for pre-sale. I'm just going to write it in. There's the link to it. And to celebrate that occasion, I've made a 15% discount for the book if you wanted to go to the website. But anyway, we're going to look at how to make these kata realistic. I mean, I understand why a kickboxer or a Muay Thai fighter or someone would say, well, the kata are a waste of time. And generally speaking, I don't argue that the way most people train kata, it's arguably for realistic fighting a waste of time. They don't care. They don't want it to be realistic. They just want it to look good so they can win a tournament or whatever, So we're going to go through some of those things. As always, most of what we're talking about is taken from Goju, in particular the Goju of the Goju founder, Miyagi CHojun. And in particular, I did want to draw back to Toguchi Seikichi, who wrote probably the first English presentation of the concept of Kaisai no Genri. Kaisai no Genri is the foundations or the keys to unlock the doors to kata. Okay, it's really interesting language that they use because I know that quite often certain pursuits have what they call knot points, Knot, points that are tied up in knots that need to be unraveled. Before Kaisai no Genri, the phrase Kaisai no Genri was chosen, Miyagi CHojun called it Toki to Musubi no Genri. Toki to Musubi no Genri means the untying and the retying, as in you tie a knot. When you tie the belt, you tie the knot in your belt, you say obi o musubu, tie the belt. Okay, so toki means to unravel a knot, and musubi means to retie it. And that tells you a lot right there, because if you're doing the kata and just going through the motions and you're not unraveling, breaking them down, pulling them apart, testing them, retesting them, trying to find the practical, realistic application, asking why that angle changes there and what this means when you retract the hand and so on. And then drawing conclusions, you test, retest, and you come to some sort of conclusion, and then you put them back together again. That's only then does your kata actually take on a living, realistic application, I think. So on page 200 of my book, I talk about Kaisai no Genri, the keys to unlock the mysteries of mastery of kata. And there's the quote by Toguchi Seikichi sensei that I mentioned, one of the great Goju teachers. The work to find hidden techniques in kata is called Kaisai in Goju Ryu Karate. The guiding principles for Kaisai is called Kaisai no Genri, or the theory of Kaisai. These terms were created by CHojun Miyagi. Okay, so we need to look into what this means, and then you combine that with some of the comments from Sosai. I, for one, would be comfortable in pointing out that I don't think Sosai would ever have won a kata contest.
Yes.
But if there was a contest to see if every single technique that you did in a kata was strong enough to knock someone out, I'd put my money on Sosai.
Yes.
Because he really did seek to find the power and application of his kata. And you know that to be so because of his 3 points, San Yoso. And those 3 points, waza no kankyu, iki no chose, chikara no kyojaku. So the timing of technique, the points of power stress, and breath control. And that's so interesting because once again, and if I refer to this beautiful book by Funakoshi Gichin, Karate do Kyohan, and he talks about the 3 cardinal points. See that? But it's very interesting that 2 of them are the same. So he points out the first one is the light, and remember, it's just translation, English translation of particular Japanese words. It's the light and heavy application of strength. So chikara no kyojaku, the point, I translated it as the points of power stress. Okay. The second one, I'll leave that for last. And the next one, fast and slow movements and techniques. Oshima Sensei, the translator, described as the fast and slow movements and techniques. I described as the tempo of techniques. And the third one, Sosai says, iki no chosei, or breath control. Now, when you think about it, when you're using breath, you look at Wim Hof and what he has been able to achieve through breath control. Everything that he does is based on a foundation of breath work. And Wim Hof, they say he's almost caused them to rewrite books on
the immune system and
different things, physiology, simply because where they said before that we don't have any control over our immune system, he's actually proving that actually you can have control, and it's all based on breath control. So Sosai placed a lot of importance in breath, and in particularly the ibuki breathing, ogare breathing, and so on that we do in karate. But the third point of Funakoshi Sensei is the expansion and contraction of the body. The expansion and contraction of, I love that, because first of all, you're not going to have that expansion and contraction of the body without strong breath control. But also, the expansion and contraction of the body is what we often talk about when you're talking about spinal adjustment, scapular retraction, and making sure that you have the spine and the posture in the correct place.
Straight and square.
Yes. Yeah. And that's another form of expansion and contraction. Whereas in karate, we see it all the time. You'll have this contraction where the movement may require a small, light, defensive movement, and then the body expands, contracting and explode, contraction and expansion all the time. And you create that feeling through your spine. When you grapple too, you'll see it all the time. If you reach out and grab a hand with a hand and it's just the arm, that's one thing. But it's when you contract and then expand and rip that in, you get optimal leverage in the movement. Bunkai, Kaisai, and Oyo. The understanding of practical application of kata techniques is known as bunkai. Everyone knows that word. As explained, the word bunkai actually refers to the breakdown and analysis of the kata. So the word bunkai, the Japanese verb bunkai suru means to break down or compartmentalize. So you break it down. You literally take a 20-move kata and separate it into 3 and 4 step sections. That's traditionally what kata was. And I even think I mentioned in the book, arguably you could say that kata came after the 2-man applications. Yeah. You had a series of applications where guys would train with each other and pressure test certain movements and combinations. And then it was only then that the masters combined a lot of those, put them together to create kata. The type of two-man pre-arranged sparring
was the tradition in China since the earliest origins of martial arts, and still provides the key method of Kaisai, in brackets, Bunkai training. Is even said by some that this kind of two-man training came before solo kata training themselves.
There you go. Kaisai, Bunkai actually means the breakdown and analysis. Kaisai takes the breakdown deeper and explores key movements and principles to interpreting kata movement. So that's where you unravel the knots. And what's a knot? A knot is, what does that mean? Oh, no, it's a block. So stand there and throw the kick. No, don't throw the punch yet. Throw the kick. Good. Okay, now throw the punch. No, not that hand, that hand. Okay, now throw the punch. Okay, now you're in trouble because your kick and punch proved completely ineffective, and now I'm going to do something else. Okay, so clearly that's a tied up knot that is not understood. So what you need to do now is break it down. So you untie the knot, you analyze it, you put it together against a non-compliant or a series of non-compliant events, and then you reform it. And when you do that, then your kata takes on so much life and energy, because now your visualization is clear about what you're doing. It's not just a movement in a kata, it's actually a realistic application.
Am I jumping ahead, Xian, to mention these, the deductive and inductive? Because is that jumping ahead?
Not really. We'll get to it, but if you want to read it now, that's really, really, just, I don't mind at all.
What you said then, our training approach is approached in two ways. I'm not sure of the Japanese pronunciation.
So that's en-ekiho, en-ekiho, and the other one is the kin-no-ho. En-ekiho and kin-no-ho.
Is the en-ekiho is the deductive. We look at the specific kata techniques in relation to the Kaisai principles and guidelines and draw a logical conclusion that is realistic. For example, the kata that sees us stepping to the left with Joranuke, the first step in Gekusai Dai, a step forward according to the second Kaisai principle says the technique is preemptive strike or simultaneous counter. So we may logically conclude that move, for example, is a forearm jolt or elbow strike to the chest or face of an opponent. In other words, the technique selected conforms to the situation of the kata, which is what you were saying.
Yeah, it's really important that people don't get locked into the idea that because I'm doing that, it's a block. In fact, when we get into Miyagi CHojun's principles later on, he actually, on the next page from that, he actually says there is no block.
Yeah, 0.5.
So, yeah, everything that you do is a block, is a lock, is a blow, is a throw. And I think that's a really important point. And the reason I coined that phrase, a block is a lock, is a blow, is a throw, is simply to encourage people to recognize that you don't, what Bruce Lee calls, get caught up in the classical mess. Just because block, downward block, boom, don't think that. The downward block could actually be a wrist release. It could actually be a tetsui strike, and so on. Miyagi Sensei, as I said, he created the principle of unraveling and retying knots. Toki to musubi no genri. Genri means the principle. Toki means to untie. Musubi means to tie. So he called that. And the idea was to focus on the kata's knot points, and through research and experimentation with a partner in a kind of prearranged kumite, unravel these knots to reveal the kata's secrets. Okay, and then he simplified that phrase to Kaisai no Genri. Toki to musubi no Genri. 9 syllables down to 5 syllables. Okay, so it just simplified it, and it means the same sort of thing. Kaisai is not a common Japanese word, but it's made up of the bunkai, the kai and bunkai, and the kai and kaisai are the same word. So it means to basically unravel and retie the knots. And I'd like to go through those key points today. That's mainly what we want to look at. First of all, the great Miyagi CHojun. He talks about, and Miyagi CHojun was the teacher of the creator of Goju and the teacher of Sosai's Goju teacher, Sonechu. Shuyo Sang Gensoku, the three primary principles. First, don't be deceived by the Embusen rule. So the Embusen is the line of movement in a kata. Turn left, block, punch. Turn right, block, punch. Turn down the middle, block, punch. They follow these embusen for a number of reasons. And sometimes it's nothing. Literally, I swear, I wasn't there when they made the kata, but I'm fairly certain that sometimes it's simply because they've got a small room. So if they didn't turn around there, they're going to hit the wall. You know, we've all been trained in dojos where we hit the wall. Okay, so it can be as simple as that. And these lines of movement were simply designed to assist in your training. So it teaches you when you turn left, bang, and then you have to turn right fast. You know, you could always ask the question, movement 9 of Taikyoku Kata, where you actually turn to your back with a Gedan Bare. We're always taught don't turn your back. So why would you turn your back? Okay, well, there's a knot point. And that should be one of the first knot points that students are asked to consider and work out. Why do I turn my back there? What's going on here? Well, one of the principles that we introduced at the dojo at some stage, and I'm sure it's not original. If there's a turn, I call it, if there's a twirl, there's a hurl. I mean, if there's a twirl, there's a hurl. If there's a turn, there's a throw. Okay, if you're turning in a kata and you got hold of someone, throw them, because no throw is going to work without a turn. Okay, so where there's a twirl, there's a hurl. So where there's a turn, you get down movement 9, you're facing that way, you're going to face that way. Instead of going there, you turn behind. And I had an interesting experience once. I was running and I got attacked by a vicious dog, a vicious terrier. It was a bull terrier. And it came at me so suddenly. And then I backed back into neko ashidachi, into cat stance, and I snap kicked it in the jaw. And I think normally, because I'm on top, I don't think it expects something to come from underneath. And it hit the jaw and it bit its tongue. And it was less like, and then the next thing you know, it's and it's turned around. And it wouldn't have done that if I just threatened it. It would have done that because I swear he would have put holes in his tongue from the snap kick. And all I did was, it attacked me 45. I sunk back into Kokotsudachi and snap kicked him with my front leg. Now, the important thing about that is I later on thought, what would have happened if he came from the other side? If my left leg is naturally my fast leg, just like a left jab is usually faster than a right cross, what would I have done? And then it made sense to me, and I'm not saying this is what I would have done, but it made sense to me that if I wanted to get my left leg in front to turn right, you turn the other way. So we turn right in the kata, movement number 9, but our left leg finishes in front. So there's a little knot that's worth thinking about and unraveling. Why do we turn? Because it ends up bringing our natural side for a natural side fighter forward. So isn't that interesting? So Miyagi CHojun says, don't be deceived by the Embusen rule. Okay, they're not strict rules that must be adhered to, and they simply provide a layout that the technique of the kata may be performed on. Kaisai take the kata as a framework, and just as in a real confrontation, there are no enforced limitations. The change in direction and angle represents the change in our response to the attacks we are faced with. Okay? So don't be deceived by the Embusen rule. In other words, don't get locked in that it must be exactly that and exactly that. It's simply to facilitate the practice of the kata. Secondly, techniques executed while advancing imply attacking techniques. Those executed while retreating imply defensive or blocking techniques. When you're moving back, it's a subtle retreat defensive motion. But when you move forward, whether it's a punch, an elbow, or even a block, it's an attacking move. And this is where Mitch mentioned before that as you move forward, It may not be a block. It could be a forearm jolt into the chest or the neck, or even an open hand strike. Pin hand 2, block down, block up, bang. Well, that could be a grab or a strike or anything. So that's a really important point. Think in terms of when I'm moving forward, I'm attacking. So what am I attacking? When I'm moving back, I'm defending. Sometimes a kick, you throw a kick as you're moving back. Well, that can be a defensive kick to push the opponent's hip away.
And that ties in beautifully with, as you said, the extra points, 0.5, there is no block.
Exactly. And the third major principle, the third primary principle, there is only one enemy and he or she is in front of you. That throws a lot of people because they think kata is, I'm here and I'm surrounded by enemies. Okay, but the fact of the matter is, even if you're surrounded by enemies, you can't attack them all at once. You can somewhat debilitate them all at once, out of your back fist this one when you're actually eye gouging that one. That's a possibility, but it's very hard to finish them by dissipating your energy like that. So whilst we use kata for multiple attack, and I have to say that's one of the beauties of karate is that it as a martial art, it does address a situation where you're confronted by more than one person, whereas everyone knows I love BJJ too, but BJJ is very much a confined situation where you're dealing with a single opponent. There is only one enemy and he or she is in front of you. So when you turn left, it's like when you spar. Mitch and I start a spar. He's on the west, I'm on the east, and we never move off that. It doesn't work like that. You're constantly moving and you're changing angles. It's the same in a kata. Turn left, you move left, like that, and you're just changing angles. So the kata should be considered in terms of you plus one opponent. And they're the three main points. Don't be deceived by the ampersand. Attacking when moving forward, defending when moving back, and there is only one enemy and he is or she is in front of you. Okay, then they're called the Shuyo Sang Gensoku, or the three primary principles. And then he has what's called Hosoku Joko. This is so interesting. The supplementary guidelines. Miyagi CHojun himself said in his book, the spirit and strength of a movement should conform with the objective of the technique, in accord with the principle of unraveling and retying the knots hidden within. Isn't that interesting? That we now have to untie those knots and apply Sosai's three principles, points of power stress, the tempo of the technique, and breath control, which gives us that conforming to the objective of that particular technique. Some techniques are done very powerfully. Some are done, and later on, Miyagi CHojun also says, don't get caught up in the timing. Just because in some kata we go, and then boom, move on to the next. The reality is, all fighting is done at super fast. So don't get caught up in that. But in terms of the objective of the techniques, you will see that some techniques, the way they're aligned, work best by applying maximal power to the technique. We've even done it ourselves. I remember in a tournament once, you move around, boom, and there's time you're kind of sparring. But then I remember once the opponent threw a leg kick at me, and that was the time for that point of power stress. And I went boom, and even as the kick came, my objective was to simultaneously strike him in the solar plexus. So there's times for both, you see. Now, we move on. Yes, we've got deductive training. We look at a kata technique in relation to it, and we draw logical conclusion that is realistic. And then you have inductive. We look not so much at the actual technique, but at the scenario presented in the kata, the angle, the range, the possibility of the attack. And then we apply realistic technique that suits. Okay, so one looks at the technique from the outside and finds a way to apply it. The other one looks at the angle and movement from the inside and finds a technique that works in that situation. Yes. I think that's very, very valuable. Now, yeah, it is. This is the key. And I'm really excited to be able to present this because I think often it's underestimated the influence. Well, Sosai never forgot it because he points out that Shin, Gi, Tai, he pointed out that the mind or the principles of the mind that are applied martial arts originate in India. The principles of Gi, Waza, technique that form the foundation of karate find their origin in China, particularly Chinese Kempo. And then Tai, the physical techniques of conditioning that karate uses are predominantly Japanese. Okay, so it's really important that we acknowledge the roots, and Kyokushin is based on, I would say, 30% Shotokan and 70% Goju, not 50-50, because the kata in Kyokushin are both Goju and the kata are both Goju and Shotokan, but the kata for the earlier beginners levels of the Shotokan kata to develop good foundation. And as Sosai says, you can find pretty well all the basic techniques in various angles and forms in the Pinan kata. Okay, and they don't do the Pinan so much in Goju. But then the advanced kata that we use in Kyokushin, the black belt katas in particular, from Goju. So I would say, I don't want to pick hairs, but 70% Goju. And so we need to acknowledge that. And a good deep study of Goju will give you a very profound understanding of what's behind Kyokushin as well. So before I go on to these points, I'm just going to quickly read Sensei Mike's, because as you know, Sensei Mike Clark, it's great to have him along. He's a 8th Dan in Goju. So I know people believe Goju relate to strong and gentle, but beyond that, Miyagi Sensei's idea was pointing towards the appreciation of opposites. So there you go. And that's Waza no Kankyu, the points of power, stress, Iki no Chosei, the breath control, and Chikara no Kyojaku, that's the points of power, stress, Waza no Kankyu, the tempo of the technique. And that all means, and in life, you could argue, Yogananda even says that life is chiaro scuro, that beautiful Italian word which means light and shade, dark and light. So it's very important that, as Miyagi Sensei did, according to Mike there, we need to appreciate the opposites. Sosai even says that in this book. One or two kata is all a person needs. I won't go on with it. I'll cut that out. But it's really, really valuable that we recognize that kata is a lesson in opposites. Time to retreat, time to attack, time to apply power, time to apply softness, that sort of thing. All Goju Ryu kata can be done in one straight line. The change in direction in kata speak more to changing the angle between you and an opponent. Couldn't have said that better myself. Thanks, Mike. There you go. And I think you could argue. In fact, we've done sessions in the past where we've taken kata, like the Taikyoku kata, and instead of turning left, right, we just go straight line for the first 10, turn around, straight line, come back. We could do 20, but we'd end up in the next door neighbor's backyard, so we don't. So there you go. Gaza, we have of late been experimenting with filling the gaps in our kata. That is, adding free-flowing techniques in between the set techniques of kata. It is interesting in untangling. That's really interesting. And that's actually interesting you say that, because one of the principles that I've been working on recently with the students to develop combinations. See, people's brains freeze when they have to create combinations unless they're well trained. So most people's brains will freeze around the third or fourth technique of a combination. Gary and Wally used to throw 17, 18, 20 technique combinations. But one way that we've been doing that is along those lines, Gaz, is that I've been working on guys going, okay, well, let's start this. Start the combination with an inside front thigh kick, left, right. Then go free, whether it's one technique or two or three or five or seven. and then finish the combination with another set that is circle out of the dead zone and throw 2 sharp lefts to the face. So you have a setup at the start, a setup at the end, and what happens in the middle is freestyle. Okay, and that's similar to what you're filling the gap that you're talking about. That's really interesting. Okay, now I just wanted to go through here to assist in clarifying those 3 primary principles. Miyagi Sensei also provided a further 9 supplementary rules, and these rules are on page 204 if you have a copy of the book. 1, every movement in every kata has significance and can be used in a real fight. So particularly people who dismiss kata as being weak, they look at certain movements and they think there's nothing in that. Maybe the kata has you coming across here like this. Okay, well, as Miyagi Sensei explains, that can actually be a very, very strong retraction control, breaking their balance, even I think dislocating the elbow is probably a tall call, but definitely when you pull the hand back, this elbow here can pop the elbow and hyperextend it and take them off their game plan. That's for sure. So the first one, every movement and every kata has significance and can be used in a real fight. How's that for one sentence to create a whole series of knots that need to be unraveled? Okay, wow. I better think about that. 2, a closed hand returning to chamber usually has something in it. And this is something we've always advocated, and that when you withdraw the hand, you're actually breaking balance, pulling something, pulling a wrist, pulling a collar, pulling an arm. Look, even an arm drag. A good arm drag comes to the hip. Whenever you withdraw a closed hand, the closed hand is an exercise of a grabbing hand, and you're pulling something in it. It's a great way to break someone's balance. 3, use the shortest distance to your opponent. That is self-explanatory. 4, if you control an opponent's head, you control the opponent. This becomes even more relevant when you grab. It's not so relevant in stand-up where there is no grappling. Isn't this interesting? Here's Miyagi CHojun Sensei, the creator of Goju karate. People think karate is punches and kicks, yet he's saying control the head, you control the body. That's a universal principle that must go back hundreds of years, I'm sure. The first time any 2 people got in a scrap, outside a cave, trying to decide who gets the meat from the saber-toothed tiger, it's like one guy leant on the other guy's head and he's going, oh, gee, that works. I like that. These principles aren't invented, they're discovered. Okay. So that's a really important principle. And once you start grappling, you'll start to realize the importance of it.
Yeah, in grappling, it's enormous.
It's huge. If you want to control someone's movement, right now, my head is free. I can go that way or that way. I can do anything I want. If Mitch pins my head that way, I can't go that way anymore. So simply by controlling my head there, he's reduced my possible applications by 50%. There you go. That's just as an example. 5, there is no block. Okay, the word that's interesting because in Japanese, jodan uke, soto uke, these, and gedan barai, downward block. It's translated as downward block. It's not. It's downward reap or a downward misdirection. Jodan uke isn't an upper block. It's an upper receiving movement where you actually are combining your movement with their movement to redirect. So this is actually a very interesting point that Miyagi Sensei makes, because the word block it. He says there is no block. Everything is a way of receiving a technique for the benefit of what comes next. 6, pay attention to the angles. An angle change is in relation to the opponent before you, not a turn to face another opponent, which goes back to the third of the major principles. There is only one opponent and he's standing in front of you. And it also points out what Sensei Mike said up there, the change in direction in kata speak more to changing the angle between you and an opponent. Boy, that guy knows his Goju, doesn't he?
course. Very much so.
Wow. Exactly. So there you go. And that's in a conformance with step point 6 of the supplementary principles. Pay attention to the angles. An angle change is in relation to the opponent before you, not a turn to face another opponent. Can't be clearer than that. This is from one of the men who created the kata that we use in our training. 7, touching your own body in a kata indicates touching your opponent. Creating a connection between you and your body and the opponent's is a key way to leverage your... Ah, man. How many times have we talked about that? And the simple illustration is, I grab Mitch's wrist, he just goes. I grab Mitch with 2 hands. It's a little bit harder, but he pulls it. I grab Mitch with 2 hands and put his arm on my body, and it's much, much harder. I grab Mitch with 2 hands on my body and shoulder pressure, and now he's having a heck of a time
Not
getting
going
out
anywhere.
of it. Yeah. Okay. So that's very much, very, very true. Is touching your own body. You like in certain kata, it can be this sort of movement. Here, touching my own body, even in boom.
I know it as Teki from Shotokan. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, or there's Nai Hanshin,
Nai
but
Hanshin,
I'm
that's it.
actually thinking of Geksai, the Geksai kata, where there's this movement at the end. Okay, touching your own body. Here, if I go here to here and I have someone's arm in it, you can be very sure that you're really containing and controlling with a lot of leverage. These points are solid
But
gold.
Xian, would it be fair to say that you can intellectualize these points, but without the experience of, I think, wrestling or grappling, it probably becomes you wouldn't understand it as well.
Probably, I agree, and I think one of the major hurdles that stand-up fighters face today is an unwillingness to grapple. If you're a 4th dan, 5th dan, 6th dan, 7th dan, and you go into a grappling school, you're a white belt. But you spent 50 years earning that 5th dan, 6th dan, or 7th dan. So you don't want to, your ego prevents you from allowing yourself the humility to go back to white belt. So there's this, oh, yeah, it's okay. Another thing is all in the kata. Some people say it's all in the kata, and they know what they're talking about. Some people say it's all in the kata, and that's their excuse for not having to train. So I think, as Sosai pointed out, in This Is Karate, there's really only one martial art, and that's the taijutsu arts, from which everything stemmed. And what created the differences is just the fundamental rules of training that different teachers chose to apply. So one teacher says, well, I'm going to grab you, and if I can get you here and here, I'm going to throw you to the ground. The other guy goes, yeah, you do that, I'm going to put a thumb in your eye and headbutt you. Okay, so the rules change. And someone else says, yeah, but thumbs in the eye and headbutts, they're really dangerous. So let's put gloves on to reduce the damage. And then someone else says, well, yeah, why don't we just put the gloves on and get rid of everything else? Oh, okay, so you have boxing, everything started. You can be sure that if in the early days of Ragnar Rothrock, what's that guy's name in Vikings?
I'm not sure.
That TV, that show on Netflix that everyone raves about is pretty good. I've started watching it. But the point is, he's not going to raid England and ask, which rules are you playing by? He goes, oh, no, we don't do. Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, it's like everything goes, and there's only one fighting system, and that's like Sosai said, only one way to do something, but if the way you do it knocks them out, that's the right way. Okay, so I think that's a really, really important point, is what differentiates things is not that you have one art or another, it's the rules of the game that you choose to train by. And if you deny, I mean, chapter 15 of This Is Karate, groundwork, 72% of what Sosai taught in his books was grappling, stand-up grappling, controls, throws, wrist locks, and groundwork. Okay, if that just straight statistics doesn't give you an idea that you need to be working on some grappling to understand what kata and what karate is, well, then I don't know what else to say. But anyway, So touching your own body in a kata indicates touching your opponent. Good. Creating a connection between your body and the opponent is a key way to leverage your power. What is leverage, Mitch?
More and more of your body against less and less of theirs.
Yes, more and more of your body connecting to less and less of theirs. Okay, so if I want to get optimal leverage, I get all my body leaning straight on that one elbow joint, and you can be fairly certain it's going to work.
We did that with arm drags on Monday.
Yes.
You were doing arm drags, then we're going Russian tie 2-on-1, and we usually do, hold the inside of the arm and the wrist, but you said no, just hold two arms here on
Yes.
on the
Yes.
upper arm, and the leverage on that is incredible. When someone gets that position, it's so challenging.
Yeah, it's so true. Number 8, contour the body. Strike hard to soft and soft to hard. I love that, and it's worth thinking about. And as an example of that, I was working doors one day, and one of the guys whacked the bloke in the mouth with a fist. And I used to only work Thursday, Friday, Saturday, so I wouldn't see guys until the next week. And I didn't see him next week. But shifts come, shifts change, people come, so I didn't take much notice of it. And then about 4 months later, he comes back. And I said, hey, man, I haven't seen you for ages. And he held up his hand, and that's all he had of his hand. He'd had this much of his hand amputated.
Wow.
And that's all he had left. Because when he hit that guy 6 months earlier, he had a cut, and he didn't give it the consideration that he should have. And he got poisoned from the septic nature of and he had to have that part of his hand amputated. So that's a really good excuse why you don't want to go cracking people in the mouth with a fist. Palm heel works, so it's soft to bone. This is why you might want to use koken too, because koken in the body, a punch in the ribs makes a lot more sense, because you're not going to get that problem of cutting your hand on the ribs. So that's a really strike hard to soft, soft to hard. Okay, the old way of doing mawashi geri was with the bone of your shin onto the neck. It was called mawashi kubi geri, roundhouse kick to the neck. So you're hitting the bone on the neck. Okay, in the old days, they used to kick the ball of the foot to the head. Interesting. I've heard that uke actually means to receive. Yes, to redirect, not so much to block or stop. Yes, exactly. And in fact, when you're demonstrating a technique, you have two people. One is called the tori, the one taking control of the technique, and one is called uke. He's the one receiving the technique. He's the fall guy. Okay, so that's true. Regarding number 7, in Okinawan dialect, muchimi, stickiness, like magnetism, is used to explain how to control someone else through touch, not holding. That's very true. And if you've ever done any sticking hands, it's true. And we have an exercise even in grappling when I'm on my back, off my back on my side, and someone's trying to, if Mitch is trying to wrap his arm around my head, all I do is I just stick to it. And I don't strengthen, because as soon as I do that, my arm goes stiff. I have no responsiveness. What I do is I relax it, and it's like it's glued together. It's just this movement. And wherever Mitch's arm goes to try and wrap around my head, all I do is I respond to it without stiffening up. That's muchimi that Sensei is talking about. So touching your own body in kata indicates touching your opponent. Creating a connection between your body and the opponent is a key way to leverage your power. That's another way of looking at it too. If your movement reduces their ability to optimize their position, you've leveraged your advantage. And the last point, there is no pause. Don't be confused by the timing in a kata's embusen. And if you've ever been in a real blue, particularly if you've ever been in a fight with more than one person, there is definitely no pause. It's like you move on and you strike things out of the corner of your eye, because it happens that quick. Okay, I'm not trying to give you the impression that I've had thousands of street fights. I haven't. I've had enough to understand certain things about violence, and certain things about the timing of techniques and lever, all that stuff, and I got lucky, and that was all really. But anyway, there is no pause. Don't be confused by the timing in a kata's embusen. So valuable. It's so true. And this is why one of Kyokushin's big problems is the stiffness in the shoulder, this sort of thing. And once you can just learn to relax and work with the method, relax your shoulders like a boxer. If you're wondering about the power in relaxation, go and watch a good boxer. So there you have it. They're the main principles as taught by Miyagi CHojun, the creator of Goju. And Goju is one of the key, or probably the key foundation systems behind Kyokushin. And I presented their 4 steps. What these are mine. I created these 4 steps just to help my own students. But the first one is dosa, so learn the movements of the kata. Then you have shingitai, apply those principles and understand. So a punch is a punch, a block is a block. Apply power, tension, and speed as appropriate according with Sosai's 3 major principles of kata training. Okay, when you have a good level of mastery, apply mental volition to your technique. So get the technique right. When it's right, apply willpower to make it strong. And then at that level, your kata should be powerful and graceful. And also in 1980 in the Nationals, I was living in an isolated environment at Thursday Island. And at this point, I was doing most of my training by myself. So I would do a kata, push-up, sit-up, squats, kata, push-up, sit-up, squats, like that. And I freed up the kata, so it was a freestyle sort of approach. And then I watched my movements in the 1980 Nationals. I understand everyone in the 1980 Nationals was a shadow of what the fighters are today. But the point was my movement and balance and everything was just, it felt so right because I'd worked so much on the kata.
Wow.
So that's the second step, is to get that applied shingitai. Work the technique, then apply willpower to the technique. And then as you do that, it will develop muscular endurance and cardiovascular endurance and so on. The third step is bunkai, break down the kata in 1 or 2 technique flows and experiment with a wider range of possibilities based on sound principles of movement. It's that simple. And then the fourth one, I'm sure I printed that. Yeah, I did print that page. And then the fourth one is the final one, oyo. Oyo means application. So that's where you pressure test against a non-compliant opponent. And don't just pressure test a technique against a non-compliant opponent by saying, all right, I'm going to actually work now to block your right hook or block your haymaker. That's not a non-compliant opponent. You've actually asked that opponent to do something specific. A non-pressure testing your technique against a non-compliant, it starts with that. How do I deal with that? How do I work that. But then total non-compliance is your opponent walks up to you and does anything they want. And that's where you pressure test your ability to respond to that stimulus. I think that is enough. That's actually enough for a lifetime of training. And if you can read chapter 18 of the book and focus deeply on how to apply the kata to your training level will, and your appreciation of kata will change dramatically.
Can I just add one point, Shian? I love on page 204, you've written here, you've drawn your based on your own experiences. I hope so. Ultimately, that's all that counts. You cannot say, apply another's conclusions to your own karate, even though their experience may assist you in finding your own answers. As also repeatedly remind students, all answers shall be revealed through the sweat of hard training. Only your conclusions count. I just love that when I read that. It's just beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
It's so accurate, right?
Well, there was that interview in New York that I was translating for Sosai, and they said, "What is Kyokushin karate?" And he said, "There is no Kyokushin karate." And what do you mean? He said, "There's Mitch karate, Mike karate, Cameron karate. You have to create your own karate based on your own experiences." And that's coming straight from Sosai. And on page 205, in the end of the book, I've got that calligraphy which I did, which means Junin, To Iro, 10 people, 10 colors. That's exactly what that means. The karate of 10 different people will have to be different. The only time it's the same is when you've got a team of people demonstrating a kata. And even then, body shape and time and so on is slightly different. Awesome session. Thanks, Margo. Covered so much. Always great when Budo Karate is referenced. Thanks. Appreciate that. Sensei Mike, I think Kata is there to help us understand distance, timing, angles, and not just fighting. Moreover, they tax the mind, and that kind of training is well worth the effort. Actually, I think that's probably central to the whole concept of Budo Karate. If it wasn't taxing your mind, it'd just be a physical exercise in fighting, and that serves no one. And as you know, life should chiefly be service. If you're not creating a better world or working towards making the world a better place, well, then I don't think you're fulfilling your potential. But anyway, I hope you got something out of that, folks. Appreciate it very much. Thanks, Alec. Yeah, I love it. I love doing these streams, and it's great to have Mitch here because he gives a really solid balance to sometimes I go off in tangents. Dallas, Kyokushin, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for today. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it very much, and I love that you all support us, all 14 of you. I got a note the other day from Google Analytics to say that I'd made $120. And I thought, that's huge. $120 in 1 month, I'm really getting there. And then I read the fine print. No, that's actually the total of what I've made since I started the YouTube channel. I'm making maybe, I don't know. But anyway, it's nice thought. I appreciate everyone's help, and everybody supports through Patreon. I appreciate that. I don't actually send a lot out to Patreon folks these days, but the Patreon allows me to do these. So make sure if you're not a subscriber, hit subscribe. We're aiming for 2 million subscribers, remember, and we're getting there. We've only got 1,997,300 to go.
And there's a special on your book at the moment too, right?
Yep, indeed. Special on the book, 15% off. Go to the website and enter in the 15% off code, end of financial year 15. And if you have one, well, then get one for a friend. Okay, so hit subscribe, hit like, leave a comment. Let me know what you think, whether we're talking through our hat. But anyway, appreciate you coming. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks, Mitch.